Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It all started like any other road trip. Mark and I, best friends since high school, decided to take a weekend drive up to Northern California. Nothing special. We'd been to LA before, but we'd never made the trek north. We didn't have a plan. We figured we'd just head out on the highway and see where the road took us. There was something about being on the open road that was freeing. No real destination, just the adventure of the journey. It was winter, and the mountains were dusted with snow, making everything look like something out of a postcard. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches stretching up toward the sky like ancient fingers. The highway twisted and turned through these snow-covered hills, with barely a car on the road. Honestly, I loved that. There's something peaceful about driving through a place where you can almost hear your own thoughts echoing. We'd been on the road for hours, cruising along with the radio playing softly in the background, when the snow started falling harder. It was that kind of snow that doesn't just fall from the sky, it drifts and swirls in the air like it's trying to tell you something. The road got slick and the temperature dropped quickly, but we were still in high spirits, talking about random stuff, making jokes, and enjoying the isolation of it all. But then, around 4 p.m., we drove into a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever, with no signs of civilization. Just snow, trees, and the distant outline of the mountains. We hadn't seen any other cars for the last half hour. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and everything was turning that flat, grayish-blue shade of late afternoon winter. The atmosphere was a little eerie, but it wasn't anything that made us feel uncomfortable at first. That's when we saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a shadow from the trees, but then I looked again, and I couldn't believe it. A snowman. A full-grown, life-size snowman, standing by itself, miles from any town or home. It was perfectly made, with a carrot for a nose, 2 coal buttons for eyes, and even a scarf wrapped neatly around its neck. It was oddly pristine, like someone had just placed it there. But the strangest thing, there was nothing else around it. No other footprints in the snow, no signs of any person nearby, just the snowman, sitting perfectly on the edge of the highway, looking like it was waiting for us. I glanced over at Mark, and I could see the same uneasy feeling crossing his face. It was too weird. We were deep into the mountains with no town for miles, and there was no way anyone would have taken the time to make that snowman out there. It just didn't make sense. But I think we were both drawn to it, like moths to a flame. "I don't know, man," Mark muttered, his voice tense. That's just not right." I agreed, but curiosity got the better of us. "Let's pull over and take a look. Maybe someone's just messing around, or maybe it's just a random thing. I mean, it's just a snowman, right?" Mark didn't answer right away, but I could see he was as intrigued as I was. He gave a reluctant nod, and I pulled the car off to the side of the highway. We parked about 30 feet from the snowman, and I immediately grabbed my phone. I thought it might be a good idea to snap a picture of it, something weird and random for the scrapbook. It didn't seem dangerous, just out of place. Maybe we'd laugh about it later, just one of those strange things that happen on a road trip. I stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. As I walked closer to the snowman, though, I started to feel wrong. There was something off about it. The way it stood there wasn't natural. It wasn't the slump of a snowman that had been abandoned after a day of play. It was posed. Its stiff posture, with the head tilted just slightly in my direction, made it look like someone had carefully positioned it, as if it were waiting for us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes, those coal black buttons, were staring right at me. I shook it off, trying to laugh at myself for being jumpy. "It's just a snowman, right?" I muttered under my breath, snapping a couple of photos. But the air, it felt colder. Not just around the snowman, but around me. My breath started coming out in small puffs of steam, like it was colder than it should have been for the time of day and weather. I glanced back at the car. Mark was still sitting in the front seat, but now he was looking at me, his face pale and tense. "Hey, man, you okay?" I called out, trying to make light of the situation. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked to something behind me. His gaze was locked on something in the distance, and his expression shifted from confusion to fear. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I froze. For a second, I thought he was just spooked by the same feeling I had. But no, this wasn't just my imagination running wild. I heard it too, rustling, a slight movement in the trees nearby. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't a passing animal. It sounded deliberate, like something or someone was waiting. I turned slowly, and my blood ran cold when I saw him. A figure. A man. Stepping out from behind one of the large pine trees that bordered the highway. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone passing through. But then I saw his posture, the way he moved, slow, deliberate, as if he'd been hiding there for a long time. He was dressed in a dark, hooded jacket, his face hidden in the shadow of his hood, and he was holding something in his hand, a crowbar. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't a casual hiker or a lost traveler. This was someone who meant us harm. My heart began to hammer in my chest. I looked at Mark, my voice barely a whisper. "Get in the car, now!" But Mark was frozen, his eyes wide with fear. Is he coming over here?" I didn't wait for an answer. The guy wasn't walking anymore. He was charging toward us, moving fast, way too fast for someone who had just been standing still in the snow. The crowbar was raised in the air, glinting in the fading light like a weapon ready to strike. I didn't think. I acted. I shoved Mark toward the car, adrenaline surging through me. "Go! Go!" We both scrambled into the car. I slammed the door shut, trying to start the engine as the guy reached the vehicle. His hand slammed against the side with a sickening thud, and I barely managed to peel out of the snowbank. I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart in my throat. The guy was running after us, faster than I'd ever seen someone run through snow. His figure blurred as I floored the gas pedal, sending the tires skidding down the icy road. For a moment, I thought we weren't going to make it. But we did. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest gas station, miles away from where the snowman stood. I couldn't even think about what had just happened. My mind was reeling. We parked, and I turned to Mark, both of us breathing hard, our bodies shaking from the adrenaline. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm but firm as I told her everything. About the snowman, the man with the crowbar, and how we barely escaped. She assured me help was on the way. After what felt like an eternity, they finally arrived. We led them back to the spot, but when we got there, the man was long gone. There was no sign of him, no trace of anything out of the ordinary. It was like nothing had happened at all. The officer looked around and said, "Could have been a trap, something to lure unsuspecting travelers. But you were lucky." We didn't say much after that. We just nodded, still processing the events before heading back home. The rest of the trip was a blur of fear and disbelief. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts. But the snowman haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there, as if waiting for us. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been placed there on purpose. A lure. A trap for people like us. And that's the part that still chills me to this day. What if we hadn't gotten in the car so fast? What if we'd hesitated just for a moment longer? Mark and I still talk about it, but we both know we'll never stop at anything that feels off in some isolated place again. The feeling of vulnerability, of having walked right into something we couldn't make sense of, still lingers. After that, we learned the hard way that curiosity doesn't always lead to good things, especially when you're miles from help. It was supposed to be a fun road trip. Just me and my best friend Mark driving through California on a winter weekend to check out some off the beaten path spots. We had no specific plans, just two guys looking to escape the usual routine and see what this part of the country had to offer. I remember it like it was yesterday. We were on a small, isolated highway between two little towns. The kind of road where if your car breaks down, you might wait for hours before anyone drives by. It had started to snow lightly a few hours before, and the temperature had dropped fast. By now, it was just below freezing, the kind of cold that feels like it cuts right through your skin and into your bones. Mark and I were just talking about how weird it was that there was no one else out here. It was like we had the whole highway to ourselves. We were about an hour from the nearest gas station when we saw him. At first, I thought it was just some guy walking along the shoulder, probably trying to make it to the next town. I didn't think much of it, but then I saw how he was moving. His legs were shaky, like he couldn't quite stand up straight, and he was hunched over as if he was trying to stay warm. Mark slowed the car down. "You think we should stop?" he asked, glancing at me. I wasn't sure. I mean, there's always that hesitation when you see someone on the side of the road. Is it safe? Is this some kind of trap? But at the same time, it felt wrong to just drive by. He looked like he was about to collapse. "Let's just check on him," I said, against my better judgment. Maybe he needs help. Mark pulled over to the side of the road. I rolled down my window and called out to him. "Hey man, you need a ride or anything?" The guy didn't respond at first. He just stood there, shivering, his head down, swaying slightly as if he was about to collapse. For a second, I thought he might have been passed out, but then he slowly raised his head, and I saw his face. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide open but bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. He looked terrified, but not in a way I could understand at the time. He shifted unsteadily, straightening up with difficulty, as though even standing was an effort. I could tell he was cold, but there was something else, something in the way he looked at us that made my stomach tighten. "You need a ride?" I asked again, this time a little more cautiously. He took a couple of shaky steps toward the car. "Yeah, I'm cold. I just need to get out of here." Mark gave me a look, and I couldn't really tell what he was thinking. We were both in our early 20s, but even we knew there was always a risk picking up strangers on the side of the road. Something about the guy just didn't sit right, but I figured it was the weather and his appearance throwing me off. He looked like he might pass out any second. "Come on, man. Get in. We'll help you out," Mark said, opening the passenger side door. The guy stumbled in, barely managing to sit down. He smelled awful, like a mix of sweat and something sour, like old food or maybe something worse. I tried not to breathe in through my nose, focusing on the road ahead, but I couldn't help but feel a knot in my stomach. Something was off about this whole situation. Mark tried to make small talk, asking him where he was headed and if he was okay. The guy barely answered. He just kept his eyes fixed on the floor of the car, rubbing his hands together as if he was still trying to warm up. We drove in silence for a while, and I remember thinking how strange it was that he wasn't speaking much. Most people, when they get a ride, at least try to chat, but he was different. About 10 minutes into the drive, Mark made another attempt at talking to him. "So, you got family around here? Where are you headed?" The guy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't have anyone," he said, his voice shaky. "I just need to get away from them." It didn't make any sense. I glanced at Mark, who gave me a look that said, "What the hell does that mean?" Before I could ask anything else, the guy suddenly straightened up. I didn't notice it at first, but he had his hand under his jacket. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just cold, adjusting his jacket, but then he jerked his hand out and I saw the glint of metal. He pulled a knife on us. It happened so quickly that I didn't process it at first. 1 second, we were just driving down the road, and the next, he had a large hunting-style knife in his hand, pointing it straight at me. His eyes were no longer bloodshot. They were wide, wild, and filled with rage. "Pull over," he demanded, his voice cold and commanding, completely different from the pathetic guy we'd picked up. Mark slammed on the brakes, swerving slightly to the side of the road, but we didn't stop. We didn't have time to. The guy's face twisted into a snarl, and his whole demeanor shifted. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't cold anymore. He was angry, dangerous. "Give me your wallet," he spat, his eyes wild. "Now!" I remember my heart thudding in my chest. I froze for a second, trying to figure out what the hell to do. I had no idea if he was going to stab us right there or if this was just a robbery, but in that moment, I felt like I was in the middle of a nightmare. It wasn't just the knife, it was the look in his eyes, the intensity, the rage. Mark didn't hesitate. He slammed the gas pedal to the floor and swerved the car forward. The guy let out a scream of frustration, trying to grab at Mark's jacket, but he couldn't get a good grip. Mark was swerving, trying to get away from him, and I leaned across the seat to shove the guy back, yelling at Mark to keep going. I don't know how we managed it, but somehow we both got a good shove in, and the guy fell back against the door. Mark kept the car moving, slamming the gas pedal down harder than I've ever heard him do before. The guy was yelling and banging on the window, still holding that knife, but we weren't stopping. We were just lucky he didn't get a good enough swing at either of us. We finally found a spot where the road widened a little bit, and Mark didn't even hesitate. He turned the car sharply to the right, fishtailing slightly, but we got enough distance to pull over safely. When we looked back, the guy had somehow managed to get out of the car. He stumbled away, still yelling, his legs shaky beneath him. We could barely see him through the rearview mirror as he disappeared into the snow. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to grip the wheel tightly just to keep control. Mark slammed the car into drive again, and we took off, heading straight to the nearest town. We didn't say much. We were both in shock. We pulled into a gas station, still in shock, when we saw a sheriff's car parked there. We told him everything that happened, and he listened carefully, nodding as we spoke. "That guy's a known troublemaker," he said. "He's been wanted for a string of robberies and attacks on travelers around here." Apparently, the guy had been using that same act, shivering, looking weak and desperate, to lure people in, then pull a knife on them and rob them. It made my blood run cold just thinking about what could have happened if we'd been a little slower or if he'd been more determined. The sheriff warned us to be more careful out there. I'm not sure if he ever caught the guy, but I've never driven on a lonely highway like that again without thinking about what almost happened to us. It was a winter night, and Kyle and I were on a road trip down the California coast, trying to catch some of the sights before heading back home. We'd been on the road for hours, and the sun had long since disappeared. The kind of darkness that settles in thick and heavy in winter had already enveloped the landscape. The drive had felt endless, and the quiet on the road was suffocating, almost unnatural. It wasn't so much the absence of light, but the eerie silence that made the night feel wrong. You know the kind, when the world seems to stop, like everything is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced over at Kyle. He had his arms folded, his eyes glued to the road, but there was tension in his posture, his shoulders tight. I don't think either of us had said much in the last hour. It was like the cold, the stillness, and the overwhelming quiet were starting to get to both of us. It wasn't just the absence of other cars, it was the strange coldness in the air. California winters are usually mild, but tonight the temperature had dropped sharply, almost unnaturally so. The wind seemed to carry an edge to it that felt out of place. The road stretched on, dark and lonely, with nothing but the occasional flicker of a streetlight passing overhead. My mind kept drifting back to the idea that this was the kind of night where something could happen, but nothing would break the silence. It felt like the world was waiting for something. I didn't know what. Neither did Kyle, but we both felt it. We had been driving for what seemed like an eternity when we decided to stop at a small diner off the side of the highway. We weren't in any rush, and honestly, we could use a break from the road. We pulled into the parking lot, which was nearly empty, and I felt an odd sense of relief to be out of the car. I could hear the quiet hum of the neon sign flickering above the diner's entrance. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. A throwback to a time when diners were the lifeblood of small towns. The walls were lined with faded photographs, and the booths were those old-school vinyl ones with cracks along the edges. It was cozy, in a way, but there was something about it that felt stuck in the past, frozen in time. We slid into a booth by the window, and I ordered coffee while Kyle went for a burger. We weren't hungry enough for a full meal, but the warmth and the caffeine would help, we thought. We were both starting to feel the weight of the drive, our eyes heavy, the quiet tension from earlier still hanging in the air. That's when he showed up. Earl, as he introduced himself, an older guy sitting at the counter by himself, his hands weathered and shaking as he nursed a cup of coffee. He looked like he had been living around here for ages, maybe even his whole life. I noticed his eyes first, kind but tired, the kind of eyes that tell stories without saying anything at all. Earl leaned over to us, his voice raspy from years of smoking and drinking too much coffee. "Traveling down the coast?" he asked, his gaze lingering on us for a moment longer than usual. "If you're trying to get somewhere quick, I'd recommend taking the back road." At first, we didn't think much of it. We were tired, but we still had a ways to go. But Earl seemed so sure, almost like he was doing us a favor. He described the main highway as being packed with tourists and suggested a shortcut through a back road that cut straight through the mountains. "Trust me, you'll save time. That road's faster than any GPS," he said, pointing vaguely out the window toward the dark expanse of the road. Kyle and I exchanged a glance. We weren't in a rush, but the promise of a shortcut seemed tempting. He went on, "You just keep going past the diner, then take the first left. It's a little off the map, but it'll save you a good hour of driving. No traffic, no fuss. You'll thank me later." The way he said it made it sound like we were getting a glimpse of some hidden, secret route, like we were being let in on some kind of local knowledge. It didn't sit entirely right with me, but I shrugged it off. What harm could it be? We finished our coffee, paid the bill, and headed back to the car. The night air had gotten even colder, biting at our skin as we made our way out of the diner and toward the road. Kyle was still quiet, his hands tight on the steering wheel as we pulled out of the parking lot. The first few miles were fine. The road was narrow, winding between thick trees, with only the occasional headlamp illuminating the path ahead. No signs, no landmarks, just a dark stretch of asphalt slicing through the dense woods. I thought about how eerie it felt, how quiet it was, but I told myself it was just the time of night. People don't usually take back roads at this hour. It was easy to convince myself it was just us, alone in the night. The temperature had dropped even more. Frost clung to the edges of the road, and I could see my breath in the air, a faint mist escaping from my mouth. The trees on either side of us were close, their branches twisting in strange angles as if they were reaching out for the car. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off. but then I saw it. Something in the rearview mirror caught my attention. Kyle kept glancing back nervously. His eyes were darting from side to side, and his jaw was clenched. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Just feels off," he muttered, looking back again. "Like we're being followed." I didn't say anything, but I could feel it too. The way the road seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows from the trees creeping closer. No other cars had passed us, no lights, no signs of life. After about 20 minutes, the road twisted sharply around a bend, and then we saw it. A group of people standing in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the headlights, maybe some hikers or some folks walking down the road, but no. There were at least 10 people, maybe more. They were spaced out evenly, standing like statues, unmoving, almost like they were waiting for us. My stomach dropped. "Do you think they need help?" Kyle asked, his voice shaky. He didn't even sound like himself. I wanted to say something reassuring, but I couldn't. We were stuck in this narrow stretch of road with nowhere to go, no space to turn around. I eased the car forward, keeping my speed slow, trying to assess what was going on. As we got closer, I saw their faces. They weren't looking at us. They weren't even moving. Their eyes were locked on something in the trees, their stares vacant, like they were in a trance. There was something wrong with them. They weren't dressed for the weather. It was freezing, yet they wore light clothing. No coats, no gloves, no hats. Some of them were barefoot. I tried to swallow the rising panic. What the hell is this? We both knew this wasn't right. Kyle was gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. There was something deeply wrong about this scene, something that made me feel like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see. Then the woman at the front turned her head. Slowly, stiffly, like she had been waiting for it. Her eyes locked on us. No emotion in her face, just emptiness. She didn't smile, didn't frown. She just stared through us like we weren't even there. The rest of them followed suit. Slowly, as if they were all moving in some synchronized, unspoken motion. It wasn't natural. It was terrifying. One of them, a man, stepped forward. He raised his hand, not in a greeting, but as if telling us to stop, to wait. I don't know what happened, but something snapped in me. A cold, primal fear flooded my veins. We couldn't stay here. We couldn't find out what these people were doing. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched, and we lurched forward. Kyle shouted at me to stop, but it was too late. The car was already surging past them. As we raced away, I swear I heard footsteps behind us. Faint at first, but growing louder, like they were chasing us. The sound of their feet hitting the road echoed in my ears, but I didn't dare look back. I kept my foot pressed down, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. The road seemed to stretch forever, each turn making the shadows feel even deeper, more oppressive. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights ahead, a small town flickering in the distance. I didn't care where it was. I just needed to get there. We pulled into the first gas station we saw. The harsh fluorescent lights a relief after the darkness we'd left behind. We parked, sitting in silence, trying to process what had just happened. Kyle and I didn't speak for a while. We didn't need to. We both knew we had narrowly escaped something. I don't know if it was a cult or just some strange random group of people, but whatever it was, it felt like we had stumbled into something we weren't supposed to see. We never spoke about it much after that, but I know Kyle's just as freaked out as I am. We never took that shortcut again, and we sure as hell never will. I don't know what those people were doing out there or what would have happened if we hadn't gotten away when we did, but I'll never forget the look in their eyes. There's something about that road, that stretch of darkness, that feels wrong. It still gives me chills just thinking about it. So yeah, if anyone offers you a shortcut down a lonely, empty back road, maybe think twice. You don't always know what's waiting in the shadows. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.